December 7, 1941, the date that would live in infamy, marked not just the beginning of America's entry into World War II, but also the birth of a legend that would haunt the Pacific waters for years to come. As Japanese bombers turned Pearl Harbor into an inferno, few could have imagined that vengeance would come from the silent depths, delivered by a single submarine whose audacity would rewrite naval warfare doctrine. The USS Wahoo, under the command of a man whose aggression bordered on recklessness, would soon become the most feared predator in the Emperor's waters, challenging every conventional understanding of submarine tactics. The early months of 1942 proved disastrous for American submarine operations in the Pacific. Most commanders operated with peacetime caution, approaching enemy vessels with excessive care, often watching from safe distances as valuable targets slipped away. The submarine service, despite its potential, seemed hamstrung by pre-war doctrine that emphasized stealth to the point of timidity. Officers trained in the old ways conducted attacks from extreme ranges, fired torpedoes that often malfunctioned, and retreated at the first sign of escort vessels. Japanese convoys moved with relative impunity across vast oceanic highways, supplying the rapidly expanding empire with the resources needed to consolidate their conquests. Into this atmosphere of frustration stepped Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Morton, an officer whose personality defied every stereotype of the cautious submariner. Morton, known universally as Mush to his friends, possessed a combination of raw courage and tactical creativity that would transform submarine warfare. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with a commanding presence, he radiated confidence that bordered on cockiness. His philosophy was simple and revolutionary. Submarines should hunt like wolves, not hide like rabbits. According to historical documentation from the Naval History and Heritage Command, Morton believed that aggressive action, even when risky, produced better results than passive caution. He argued that a submarine's greatest weapon was not stealth alone, but the psychological advantage of audacity. When Morton assumed command of the USS Wahoo in late 1942, the submarine had already completed 2 war patrols with mediocre results. The Wahoo, a Gato-class submarine commissioned in May of 1942, was one of 77 boats of her class, measuring 311 feet in length and capable of diving to depths of 300 feet. She carried 24 torpedoes and a crew of 60 men who would soon discover that their new captain intended to use every single weapon in ways no one had imagined. Morton's arrival coincided with another critical addition to the crew, Lieutenant Richard Hetherington O'Kane, who would serve as executive officer and approach officer, the man responsible for calculating firing solutions during attacks. The partnership between Morton and O'Kane would prove legendary, combining Morton's aggressive instincts with O'Kane's technical brilliance. O'Kane, a Naval Academy graduate who would later become one of the war's most successful submarine commanders himself, shared Morton's conviction that the submarine war could only be won through offensive action. Together, they developed revolutionary tactics. Morton would command from the bridge or conning tower rather than the traditional position at the periscope, maintaining situational awareness while O'Kane calculated attacks. This freed both men to perform their roles with maximum efficiency, a seemingly simple innovation that would multiply the Wahoo's effectiveness. The crew, initially uncertain about their new captain's aggressive reputation, would soon embrace his philosophy with religious fervor. January 16, 1943, marked the beginning of the USS Wahoo's 3rd war patrol, the mission that would establish her legendary reputation. As the submarine departed Pearl Harbor, Morton gathered his crew and delivered a speech that would become famous in submarine lore. He told them plainly that he intended to take the fight directly to the enemy, that running from escorts was over, and that the Wahoo would operate in shallow, dangerous waters where other submarines feared to venture. Some crew members felt excitement, others experienced cold dread. Morton didn't care about popularity, he cared about results. The patrol orders directed the Wahoo toward the waters off New Guinea and into the restricted zones near Japanese strongholds, areas where enemy activity was heavy, and American submarines typically avoided surface operations. The Wahoo's hunting grounds would be the Bismarck Sea and the waters surrounding New Guinea, where Japanese convoys moved supplies and troops to support their garrison forces. These were not the open ocean expanses where submarines could dive deep and escape. These were shallow, confined waters patrolled by aircraft and destroyers. Morton studied intelligence reports obsessively, looking for patterns in Japanese convoy routes. He understood that the greatest targets, troop transports and large cargo vessels, traveled in heavily defended convoys, precisely the targets most submarine commanders avoided. But Morton saw opportunity where others saw risk. His logic was straightforward. If the Japanese concentrated their defenses around valuable ships, then those were exactly the ships worth attacking regardless of danger. On January 24, 1943, the Wahoo encountered her first significant target of the patrol, a Japanese convoy consisting of several ships and escorts traveling along the New Guinea coast. Most submarine commanders would have maneuvered carefully, waited for the convoy to disperse or attacked from maximum range. Morton did the opposite. He positioned the Wahoo directly in the convoy's path and waited, allowing the enemy ships to approach at close range. O'Kane worked frantically at the attack periscope, calculating speeds and angles while Morton called observations from above. The crew stood at battle stations, hearts pounding, knowing they were committed to an approach that left little room for error. The first torpedoes leaped from the Wahoo's tubes at ranges so close that lookouts could see the rivets on enemy hulls through the periscope. The explosions that followed were catastrophic. The first ship, a large freighter, took 2 torpedoes amidships and began settling immediately, her cargo of military supplies destined for the ocean floor. But Morton wasn't finished. While escort destroyers scrambled to respond, he swung the Wahoo around and fired again, hitting a second vessel. The Japanese escorts, shocked by the submarine's aggressive positioning, struggled to coordinate their response. Depth charges began falling, but Morton had already changed position, moving toward rather than away from the remaining targets. It was submarine warfare as no one had practiced it. More cavalry charge than careful stalk. Over the following hours, Morton demonstrated tactics that seemed suicidal to conventional thinking. When destroyers charged toward the Wahoo's position, he turned toward them, closing the distance rather than fleeing. This counterintuitive maneuver confused the Japanese sonar operators, whose equipment struggled to track a target moving directly toward them. The psychological effect was even more significant. Destroyer captains expected submarines to run, not fight. This moment of hesitation, this fraction of confusion, gave the Wahoo the seconds needed to slip away or reposition for another attack. Morton understood that in combat, aggression itself became a weapon, that violating enemy expectations created opportunities that caution never could. The encounters that followed established a pattern that would define the Wahoo's third patrol. Morton hunted in areas other submarines abandoned as too dangerous, operated on the surface at times when conventional doctrine demanded submerged caution, and attacked convoys that seemed too well defended to approach. His crew, initially terrified by his methods, began to trust his instincts. They realized that Morton possessed an almost supernatural ability to read enemy movements, to anticipate responses, and to exploit the brief windows of opportunity that his aggression created. The Wahoo was no longer just a submarine. She had become a weapon wielded by a master who understood that in war, fortune favors not just the bold but the intelligently bold. January 26, 1943, brought an encounter that would define the Wahoo's reputation and test Morton's philosophy to its breaking point. Early morning reconnaissance revealed a Japanese convoy of unusual composition, several large transports accompanied by no fewer than 4 destroyers, an escort force that signaled the convoy's importance. Most submarine commanders would have observed from a distance, perhaps attempting a long-range shot before retreating. Morton saw the heavy escort as confirmation that the transports carried valuable cargo or troops, making them precisely the targets worth the greatest risk. He made a decision that seemed insane to conventional naval thinking. He would attack the convoy in broad daylight on the surface using the Wahoo's deck gun in addition to torpedoes. The tactical situation appeared impossible. The convoy traveled in a defensive formation, specifically designed to protect against submarine attack, with destroyers screening the transports and maintaining active sonar sweeps. Any submarine detected would face coordinated depth charge attacks from multiple vessels simultaneously. The shallow coastal waters offered little room for deep evasive maneuvers. Yet Morton saw advantages in the apparent disadvantages. The Japanese, precisely because they felt secure with such heavy escorts, would not expect an aggressive surface attack. Their very confidence created vulnerability. He called his crew to battle stations and began a surface approach, using the Wahoo's diesel engines to close the distance at speeds a submerged submarine could never match. O'Kane, peering through the periscope during periodic observations, calculated firing solutions while Morton conned the boat from his unconventional position where he could see the entire tactical picture. The distance closed. 5,000 yards, 4,000, 3,000. The Wahoo ran on the surface, her gray hull lost against the morning sea's glare. Japanese lookouts, scanning for periscope feathers or torpedo wakes, failed to notice the submarine approaching at hull level. At 2,000 yards, Morton made his move. The Wahoo's torpedoes, set for shallow running in the coastal waters, leaped toward the lead transport. Seconds later, massive explosions tore through the Japanese vessel's hull. She began listing immediately, clearly mortally wounded. The Japanese destroyers reacted with practiced efficiency, turning toward the attack's origin and accelerating to flank speed. But here, Morton's unorthodox tactics paid devastating dividends. Instead of crash diving and fleeing, he turned the Wahoo directly toward the nearest destroyer and increased speed. The Japanese captain, seeing a submarine charging his vessel on the surface, experienced a moment of complete cognitive dissonance. Submarines didn't behave this way. They dove and ran. This aggressive maneuver violated every doctrine, every training scenario, every previous encounter. That moment of hesitation, perhaps only seconds long, proved fatal. The destroyer turned to bring more weapons to bear, presenting a larger profile. Morton fired a spread of torpedoes at point-blank range. The destroyer, whose name was later identified from Japanese records as the Harusami, took at least one torpedo directly in her forward section. The explosion was catastrophic, breaking the destroyer's back and causing her to fold in the middle. Japanese sailors scrambled toward life rafts as their ship began her death plunge. But the Wahoo's attack wasn't finished. Morton, still on the surface despite now facing 3 remaining destroyers, maneuvered toward the second transport. His crew, operating with practiced precision despite the insanity of surface combat, reloaded torpedo tubes with desperate speed. The torpedo men worked, knowing that every second on the surface increased their vulnerability. Yet they functioned with mechanical efficiency born from training and trust in their captain's judgment. The second transport, watching the Harusami die, attempted evasive maneuvers, but Morton had anticipated the turn. O'Kane's firing solution compensated for the transport's desperate course changes. Another spread of torpedoes crossed the short distance. More explosions. The transport shuddered and began settling by the stern. Her cargo, later intelligence would confirm she carried troops and military equipment, doomed. Only then did Morton give the order to dive. The Wahoo slipped beneath the waves as depth charges began falling, but the Japanese destroyers, demoralized by witnessing a submarine sink their comrade in surface combat, prosecuted their attack with less aggression than their training demanded. Morton had done more than sink ships. He had shattered the psychological confidence of the enemy escort forces, a victory whose value extended far beyond the immediate battle. January 26, 1943, the same day as the destroyer engagement, would present the Wahoo with a target that would cement her reputation while also creating controversy that would persist for decades. Intelligence reports and convoy analysis suggested that a large Japanese transport vessel, the Buyomaru, was operating in the area carrying troops destined for the New Guinea garrison. The Buyomaru, a vessel of approximately 5,000 tons, represented exactly the kind of target that could swing the strategic balance in the Pacific theater. Japanese reinforcements to their island garrisons extended the war and cost American lives. Preventing those reinforcements had clear military value. Morton located the Buyomaru in the early afternoon, escorted by a single destroyer and several smaller patrol craft. The transport rode low in the water, clearly heavily loaded. Through the periscope, Lookouts could see soldiers crowding the decks, suggesting the vessel carried far more troops than her normal capacity would indicate. The Japanese, desperate to reinforce their positions, were overloading transports and accepting the risks. For Morton, the target's military value was unquestionable. The men aboard that ship would, if they reached their destination, fight American and Allied forces. Preventing their arrival was a legitimate military objective that could save Allied lives. The attack developed according to Morton's now established pattern of aggression. The Wahoo maneuvered into firing position, waited for the optimal angle, and fired a spread of torpedoes. The first torpedo struck the Buyeo-Maru amidships, exactly at the waterline. The explosion tore a massive hole in the transport's hull, and she began taking on water immediately. A second torpedo hit moments later, ensuring the vessel's fate. The Buyeo-Maru began listing heavily as Japanese soldiers scrambled to abandon ship. Life rafts deployed, and men jumped into the water, hundreds of them, creating a scene of chaos and desperation. The escort destroyer, faced with the choice between pursuing the submarine or rescuing survivors, chose the latter, dropping depth charges in a perfunctory manner while moving toward the sinking transport. What happened next would become one of the most controversial aspects of the Wahoo's third patrol. Morton, observing through the periscope, saw Japanese survivors beginning to swim away from the sinking transport. Some reached life rafts, others clung to debris. Standing orders regarding survivors were ambiguous. The Geneva Conventions addressed surface ship warfare, but submarines, by their nature, could rarely rescue enemy survivors without exposing themselves to unacceptable risk. Most submarine commanders simply left the area after attacks, allowing escort vessels to perform rescue operations. Morton made a different decision. According to later accounts from crew members, documented in various post-war histories, Morton ordered the Wahoo to surface and engage the survivors with deck gun and machine gun fire. The crew's recollections of this incident vary in detail, but agree on the essential facts. The Wahoo surfaced among the survivors and opened fire. Morton's stated reasoning, communicated to his crew, was that these were soldiers who would fight again if rescued, that the escort destroyer was attempting to recover them, and that preventing the enemy from salvaging these troops had military value. Some crew members executed the orders without question. Others did so with moral qualms they would carry for life. The engagement lasted perhaps 20 minutes before the approaching escort destroyer forced the Wahoo to dive and withdraw. When the Wahoo finally departed, hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay dead in the water, either from the original sinking or from the subsequent surface attack. The incident would remain classified during the war years, but post-war disclosure created significant debate among military historians and ethicists. Some argued that Morton's actions, while brutal, fell within the technical boundaries of legitimate warfare. Armed soldiers being transported to combat zones were legitimate targets even when shipwrecked. Others contended that firing upon helpless survivors violated fundamental principles of warfare, regardless of technical legalities. The U.S. Navy never formally censured Morton, and his patrol was credited with destroying the troops as enemy combatants. Yet the moral complexity of the incident persists in historical discussions. What remains undebatable is the military effect. The Buyeo-Maru's entire complement of troops, estimated at over 1,000 men, never reached their destination, and the psychological impact on Japanese convoy operations was substantial when word of the aggressive American submarine reached enemy commanders. The days following the Buyeo-Maru engagement saw the Wahoo transform into what Morton called a one-boat wolf pack, a reference to the German U-boat tactics of coordinated submarine attacks. Between January 27 and February 7, 1943, the Wahoo conducted a campaign of destruction that seemed impossible for a single submarine. Morton's patrol report, preserved in naval archives, details engagement after engagement, each conducted with the same aggressive philosophy that characterized the earlier attacks. He hunted in waters that intelligence marked as too dangerous for solo operations, operated on the surface when other submarines remained submerged, and pursued targets that conventional wisdom suggested were too well defended to approach. The shallow waters of the Bismarck Sea and the approaches to Wewak Harbor became the Wahoo's killing ground. Morton studied Japanese shipping patterns with obsessive attention, learning to predict convoy routes and timing. He understood that Japanese naval doctrine emphasized schedule adherence. Convoys departed and arrived at specific times to coordinate with port operations and escort availability. This predictability, intended to enhance efficiency, became a vulnerability that Morton exploited ruthlessly. He would position the Wahoo along known routes, then wait submerged until sonar detected the approaching propeller sounds of enemy vessels. The waiting tested crew nerves, hours of silent running while air quality deteriorated and temperatures rose. But Morton's timing proved consistently accurate. On January 30th, 1943, the Wahoo intercepted another convoy near the coast of New Guinea. This engagement demonstrated Morton's evolving tactical sophistication. Rather than attacking the convoy's center, he positioned the Wahoo at the convoy's front, then fired torpedoes down the length of the formation. This down-the-throat shot, aimed at vessels approaching the submarine's position, was considered extremely difficult and risky. A miss meant the target would pass directly over the submarine's position, allowing escorts to attack with devastating accuracy. But Morton had practiced the approach and trusted O'Kane's calculations. The lead freighter, unable to maneuver away from torpedoes approaching from directly ahead, took 2 hits and sank within minutes. The Wahoo's fourth confirmed kill of the patrol, a tanker designated in Japanese records as carrying aviation fuel, presented different challenges. Tankers, because of their cargo, tended to burn rather than simply sink when torpedoed. Morton fired a spread that struck the tanker's midsection, and the resulting explosion created a fireball visible for miles. The tanker, her hull ruptured and cargo igniting, burned with such intensity that Morton could feel the heat even from the Wahoo's submerged position nearby. Japanese escorts, overwhelmed by the fires and unable to approach their dying charge, concentrated on depth charge attacks against the Wahoo. But Morton had already withdrawn to a safe distance, using the burning tanker as a visual screen that made periscope detection nearly impossible. Between January 31st and February 3rd, 1943, the Wahoo sank 3 more confirmed vessels, 2 freighters and a transport, while damaging several others. Each engagement followed Morton's pattern of aggressive maneuvering, close-range shots, and quick withdrawal before escorts could coordinate responses. The crew, initially terrified by Morton's tactics, now operated with confidence born from repeated success. They had learned to trust their captain's instincts, to execute orders with split-second timing, and to function efficiently under conditions of extreme stress. The Wahoo had become a perfectly synchronized weapon, with Morton's strategic vision translating through O'Kane's technical skill into devastating attacks executed by a crew that now believed themselves invincible. Japanese naval intelligence, monitoring the sudden spike in shipping losses in the Wewak area, initially attributed the attacks to multiple submarines operating in coordination. The idea that a single submarine could be responsible for such widespread destruction seemed impossible. When analysis of survivor reports and attack patterns suggested that one vessel might indeed be responsible, Japanese escort doctrine was hastily revised. New orders directed destroyers to pursue and destroy aggressive submarines rather than prioritize convoy protection, to hunt the hunter rather than merely defend. But these revised tactics, sensible in theory, proved difficult to execute against a commander as unpredictable as Morton. He never operated where enemy expectations suggested he would be, never followed patterns that allowed anticipation, and never provided the sustained contact that prosecution of a submarine attack required. February 4, 1943 marked an operation so audacious that senior submarine commanders would later debate whether Morton's success justified the risk or whether he had simply been extraordinarily lucky. Intelligence reports indicated that Wewak Harbor, a major Japanese naval anchorage on the New Guinea coast, contained multiple high-value targets including transports, auxiliaries, and possibly even warships. The harbor, naturally defensible and heavily fortified with coastal batteries and patrol craft, was considered effectively off-limits to submarine attack. The narrow entrance, constant patrol activity, and shallow depths made penetration suicidal by conventional assessment. Morton decided to enter anyway, The plan violated virtually every safety protocol in submarine operations doctrine. Wewak Harbor's entrance channel was barely wide enough for safe submarine navigation, particularly when accounting for the need to maneuver while submerged. The harbor floor's depth varied unpredictably, creating the risk of grounding. Patrol craft maintained constant surveillance of the entrance, making undetected entry extremely difficult. Most critically, any submarine discovered inside the harbor would be trapped. The single entrance that allowed ingress would become a fatal bottleneck during escape. Naval historians, reviewing the operation decades later with access to Japanese defensive positions, have estimated that Morton's probability of surviving the penetration at less than 30%. Morton's approach demonstrated both careful planning and willingness to accept calculated risk. He studied tidal charts extensively, determining the optimal time when water depth would maximize maneuvering room, while darkness would aid concealment. He positioned the Wahoo outside the harbor during daylight, conducting careful periscope observations of patrol patterns. He noted the timing of patrol craft movements, the locations of searchlight positions, and the coordination patterns between different defensive elements. When night fell on February 4th, Morton took the Wahoo toward the harbor entrance at periscope depth, timing his approach to coincide with a patrol craft's departure, creating a brief window in the defensive coverage. The transit into Wewak Harbor tested every crewman's nerve. The Wahoo proceeded at minimal speed, nearly silent, with the entire crew holding their breath during critical moments. The narrow entrance channel forced Morton to navigate with extraordinary precision. Any deviation risked grounding or collision with unseen obstructions. Sonar operators listened desperately for the sounds of patrol craft engines, knowing that detection would mean certain death. The harbor's acoustic properties worked against the submarine. Sounds echoed confusingly, making threat direction assessment difficult. Yet Morton's navigation proved flawless. The Wahoo slipped through the entrance undetected and entered the harbor's main basin just before midnight. Inside the harbor, Morton confronted a target-rich environment beyond his most optimistic expectations. Through the periscope, illuminated by moonlight and harbor lights, dozens of vessels lay at anchor: transports, freighters, tankers, and auxiliary craft. Japanese security doctrine, assuming the harbor's defensive perimeter made penetration impossible, maintained minimal internal alert status. Vessels sat at anchor with minimal watch crews, navigation lights illuminated, positioned for loading and unloading operations rather than combat readiness. Morton studied the anchorage carefully, selecting targets based on size and apparent military value, calculating firing positions that would maximize damage while maintaining maneuverability for escape. The attack began at approximately 0100 hours on February 5, 1943. The Wahoo's torpedoes, fired at extremely close range against stationary targets, achieved devastating accuracy. The first spread struck a large transport, the explosions tearing through the quiet night and immediately alerting the entire harbor. Chaos erupted as Japanese personnel scrambled to battle stations. Searchlights began sweeping the water, and patrol craft raced toward the perceived attack origin. But Morton had anticipated the response. Before the first target finished sinking, the Wahoo had already repositioned and fired again, striking a second vessel. The confusing acoustic environment worked to Morton's advantage now. Defensive forces struggled to locate the submarine among the echoes and explosions. For the next 40 minutes, the Wahoo conducted a systematic destruction of Wewak Harbor's anchored shipping. Morton fired, maneuvered, fired again, each time selecting new targets and new firing positions. Japanese defensive fire became increasingly frantic and increasingly inaccurate, as confusion overwhelmed coordination. Depth charges fell, but in a harbor crowded with friendly vessels, Japanese forces could not employ weapons freely without risking fratricidal damage. Some patrol craft fired at periscope sightings that proved to be debris or false contacts. The psychological advantage of audacity served Morton brilliantly. Japanese commanders, unable to believe a submarine would actually penetrate the harbor, initially suspected sabotage or internal attack, delaying coordinated response. February 5, 1943, 0200 hours. The Wahoo had exhausted her torpedo inventory, and faced the seemingly impossible task of escaping from a fully alerted Wewak harbor. Behind the submarine, fires burned on at least 5 vessels, 2 of which were clearly sinking while others sustained serious damage. Japanese defensive forces, having overcome their initial confusion, now concentrated exclusively on locating and destroying the intruder. Patrol craft crisscrossed the harbor in search patterns. Searchlights swept the water's surface continuously, and coastal batteries stood ready to fire on any surface contact. The harbor entrance, the Wahoo's only escape route, was now the focus of maximum defensive concentration. Morton faced a tactical dilemma with no good solutions. Remaining in the harbor guaranteed eventual detection and destruction. Dawn would arrive in approximately 4 hours, and daylight would make concealment impossible in the harbor's relatively shallow, clear waters. Attempting to transit the entrance submerged meant navigating the narrow channel, while patrol craft concentrated their search directly in the escape route. Attempting a surface escape would expose the Wahoo to immediate gunfire from multiple positions. Every option carried extreme risk. Morton chose characteristically aggressive action. He would attempt a submerged transit of the entrance channel at maximum safe speed, betting that patrol craft would not expect such a bold move and would instead assume the submarine was hiding somewhere in the harbor's recesses. The escape attempt began at 0230 hours. Morton took the Wahoo to periscope depth and headed directly toward the harbor entrance at 8 knots, faster than standard procedure recommended for submerged harbor navigation, but necessary to clear the danger zone quickly. The submarine's sonar painted a picture of multiple patrol craft near the entrance, some stationary and apparently listening, others moving in search patterns. Morton studied the tactical situation through quick periscope observations, timing his approach to pass between patrol craft positions during momentary gaps in their coverage. The margin for error was measured in yards and seconds. As the Wahoo entered the channel's narrowest section, a Japanese patrol craft detected propeller sounds and began an attack run directly toward the submarine's position. The patrol craft captain, uncertain of contact's exact location, but certain that something was moving through the channel, prepared to drop depth charges in a pattern that would cover the entire channel width. Morton, listening to sonar reports and judging distances with split-second precision, made a decision that seemed suicidal. He ordered increased speed rather than the standard evasive slowing. The Wahoo accelerated in the narrow channel, racing toward the patrol craft rather than away from it. The maneuver's logic was brutally simple. The patrol craft needed time to position precisely and drop depth charges at the optimal location. By accelerating toward the enemy vessel, Morton reduced that available time while simultaneously complicating the patrol craft captain's firing solution. The Japanese vessel, expecting submarine evasion tactics, found itself suddenly in a high-speed meeting engagement with ranges closing faster than anticipated. The patrol craft dropped depth charges, but the Wahoo had already passed the optimal detonation point. The explosions occurred behind the submarine, still dangerous, but not immediately fatal. The Wahoo shuddered from the concussions. Light fixtures shattered and crew members were thrown against equipment, but the hull integrity held. Morton pressed the escape, driving the Wahoo through the channel's final section while more patrol craft converged on the area. Additional depth charges fell, creating a barrage that seemed inescapable in the confined waters. The Wahoo's crew endured an experience of pure terror, depth charges detonating close enough to slam the submarine sideways, electrical systems flickering, minor leaks springing in hull fittings, and the constant fear that the next explosion would be the one that ruptured the pressure hull. Yet Morton's navigation remained precise even under these conditions, keeping the Wahoo in the deepest part of the channel, where water depth provided minimal protection from the explosions occurring above. At 03:15 hours on February 5, 1943, the USS Wahoo emerged from Wewak Harbor's entrance channel and reached the deeper coastal waters beyond. Morton took the submarine down to 200 feet, below the effective range of further depth charge attacks, and withdrew from the area at maximum submerged speed. Behind the Wahoo, Wewak Harbor burned, and Japanese commanders struggled to comprehend how a single submarine had penetrated their defenses, destroyed multiple vessels, and escaped. The harbor penetration would become legendary in submarine service history, studied in naval academies as an example of tactical audacity, while simultaneously being cited as an example of risk-taking that should never be encouraged. Morton had achieved the impossible, but the cost, measured in crew stress, equipment damage, and sheer luck required, raised questions about whether such operations could ever be considered repeatable doctrine. February 6th through 21st, 1943 marked the Wahoo's transit back to Pearl Harbor, a journey that allowed Morton time to compile his patrol report and the crew time to process what they had experienced. The submarine's passage through waters now largely controlled by American forces proceeded without incident, but the atmosphere aboard the Wahoo was far from relaxed. Every crew member understood they had participated in something extraordinary, a patrol that had exceeded every reasonable expectation for submarine effectiveness. Conversations among the crew mixed exhilaration with exhaustion, pride with recognition of how close they had come to death multiple times. Morton spent hours in his quarters preparing the patrol report, a document that would become one of the most famous in submarine force history. The report's tone, straightforward and factual rather than boastful, detailed each engagement methodically while also explaining the tactical reasoning behind decisions that violated conventional doctrine. Morton knew his aggressive tactics would face scrutiny from senior commanders, some of whom remained committed to more cautious approaches. His report needed to justify the risks taken while demonstrating that aggression, properly applied, produced results that caution could never achieve. He documented 19 vessels either sunk or seriously damaged, making the Wahoo's third patrol statistically the most successful submarine mission of the Pacific War to date. O'Kane, meanwhile, worked with the crew to document torpedo performance, attack geometries, and lessons learned from each engagement. The accumulated data suggested that American torpedoes, when used at close range against properly identified targets, performed far better than the statistically poor performance reported by more cautious submarine operations. This observation, controversial because it implied that many torpedo failures resulted from excessive caution rather than equipment defects, would influence submarine force doctrine in subsequent months. The Wahoo's experience suggested that aggressive attacks, despite their risks, actually reduced overall mission danger by decreasing time in contact with enemy forces and by psychologically overwhelming enemy defensive responses. On February 21, 1943, the USS Wahoo surfaced in the channel approaching Pearl Harbor and proceeded to the submarine base. Word of the patrol's success had preceded the submarine's arrival. Radio communications had reported some of the Wahoo's achievements, and intelligence analysts had correlated Japanese reports of shipping losses with the Wahoo's operational area. The Submarine Force Command anticipated something exceptional, but even they were unprepared for the full scope of Morton's achievements. As the Wahoo approached the dock, the scene that greeted her crew would become iconic in submarine force lore. The pier was crowded with personnel from across the submarine base, from senior admirals to enlisted support staff. A band played in celebration. Flags flew from every available position. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarine Force Pacific, stood on the pier personally to greet the Wahoo's arrival, an honor rarely bestowed on returning submarines. As the Wahoo tied up and Morton emerged from the conning tower, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers that could be heard across the harbor. Lockwood, grasping Morton's hand, reportedly said, "This is the greatest submarine patrol of this war," a statement that would be repeated in official citations and historical accounts for decades to come. The crew's reception mixed celebration with careful debriefing. Intelligence officers interviewed every crew member who had participated in attack observations, correlating their accounts with Morton's patrol report to construct the most accurate possible record of the patrol's events. The Buyo Maru incident, while mentioned in the patrol report, received less public attention. Classified protocols restricted discussion of potentially controversial actions, and the Navy had no interest in generating negative publicity that might undermine submarine force morale. The crew, bound by military secrecy requirements, largely remained silent about aspects of the patrol that troubled them, focusing instead on the undeniable tactical success. Morton's patrol report underwent extensive analysis by the Submarine Force Command staff. The aggressive tactics he had employed, initially viewed with skepticism by some senior officers, now commanded serious reconsideration. If one submarine, properly commanded and aggressively employed, could achieve such results, then perhaps the entire submarine force strategy needed revision. Lockwood, who had long advocated for more aggressive submarine operations, saw in Morton's patrol vindication of his own beliefs. He began circulating the Wahoo's patrol report to other submarine commanders as an example of effective tactics, essentially making Morton's approach the new doctrinal standard for Pacific submarine operations. The months following the Wahoo's third patrol saw Morton and his submarine become legendary figures within the submarine force and, to the extent that wartime security permitted, within the broader Navy. Morton received the Navy Cross, America's second highest military decoration, for his actions during the patrol. The citation, while necessarily vague about specific operational details, praised his extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in combat against enemy forces. Crew members received their own commendations, recognizing that the Wahoo's success resulted from coordinated team effort rather than simply bold command decisions. O'Kane, Morton's executive officer, received particular recognition for his role in executing the complex attacks that had destroyed so many enemy vessels. The Wahoo's fourth patrol, conducted in March and April of 1943, achieved similar levels of success, sinking additional enemy vessels and further cementing Morton's reputation as the submarine force's most aggressive and effective commander. The fifth patrol, in May and June, continued the pattern. Morton had developed and refined a tactical approach that seemed almost impossible to counter: aggressive positioning, close-range attacks, and psychological dominance over enemy escort forces. Japanese convoy commanders began requesting additional escorts specifically for routes where the Wahoo was suspected to operate, a defensive reaction that dispersed Japanese escort forces and made other areas more vulnerable to different American submarines. O'Kane, having completed multiple patrols with Morton and thoroughly absorbed his mentor's tactical philosophy, received his own command in the summer of 1943. He would go on to become one of the war's most successful submarine commanders, captaining the USS Tang and eventually receiving the Medal of Honor for his actions. The Morton-O'Kane partnership had not only produced immediate tactical success, but had also created a generation of submarine commanders who understood that aggression, properly applied, was not recklessness, but rather the most effective form of submarine warfare. This doctrinal shift, inspired largely by the Wahoo's example, contributed significantly to the submarine force's increasing effectiveness as the war progressed. The broader strategic impact of the Wahoo's operations extended beyond the immediate vessels sunk. Japanese shipping losses in the Pacific, already serious, accelerated dramatically as more American submarines adopted Morton's aggressive tactics. Japan's island garrisons, dependent on sea supply lines, began experiencing critical shortages of food, ammunition, and reinforcements. The psychological effect on Japanese merchant marine crews became significant. Sailing the Pacific routes transformed from dangerous duty to near-suicidal assignment. Insurance rates for Japanese shipping, in the portions of the merchant fleet still operating under commercial insurance, became prohibitive. The Wahoo, along with other submarines following Morton's example, was strangling Japan's ability to sustain its far-flung empire. Morton's fame within the submarine force had practical consequences for submarine force recruitment and morale. Young officers requested submarine duty, specifically hoping to serve under aggressive commanders like Morton. Crew members from other submarines requested transfers to boats known for offensive operations. The submarine service, previously considered a backwater assignment compared to glamorous surface fleet positions, became one of the Navy's most sought-after postings. This shift in perception helped the submarine force attract and retain the highest quality personnel, creating a virtuous cycle where better crews enabled more successful operations, which in turn attracted even better recruits. However, not everyone in Naval Command viewed Morton's methods with unqualified approval. Some senior officers, particularly those with surface warfare backgrounds, argued that Morton's tactics were unsustainably risky, that his success resulted as much from luck as skill, and that encouraging other commanders to imitate his methods would lead to unnecessary submarine losses. These critics pointed out that submarines were expensive, complex vessels requiring months to build and train crews for, and that losing boats to overly aggressive tactics would undermine the submarine force's strategic effectiveness. The debate between aggressive and cautious tactical approaches would continue throughout the war, though Morton's consistent results made his methods increasingly difficult to criticize. The intelligence gathered during the Wahoo's patrols also provided significant value beyond the immediate tactical successes. Morton's close-range observations of Japanese convoy tactics, escort procedures, and defensive responses generated detailed information that intelligence analysts used to refine attack doctrine for the entire submarine force. His after-action reports included sketches of Japanese ship silhouettes, notes on sonar characteristics of different vessel types, and observations about Japanese radio communication patterns during convoy operations. This accumulated intelligence helped other submarine commanders identify targets more accurately and exploit Japanese tactical weaknesses more effectively. October 5, 1943. The USS Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor for her 7th war patrol, heading toward the Sea of Japan through the dangerous La Pérouse Strait between Sakhalin and Hokkaido. This patrol would take the Wahoo into waters that were among the most heavily defended in the Pacific theater, areas where Japanese anti-submarine forces maintained constant vigilance precisely because these waters were so close to the Japanese home islands. Morton, as aggressive as ever, saw the Sea of Japan as the ultimate hunting ground. Japanese shipping there operated with minimal escort protection because the Japanese believed the area was too dangerous for American submarines to penetrate. Morton intended to prove them wrong. The La Pérouse Strait presented formidable challenges. Shallow waters, strong currents, extensive minefields, and heavy patrol activity made transit extremely hazardous. Most American submarines avoided the area entirely. Morton characteristically saw the very factors that made the strait dangerous as reasons why the payoff for successful penetration would be enormous. Japanese shipping in the Sea of Japan, believing themselves safe from submarine attack, operated with minimal security precautions. Convoys traveled without escorts, ships sailed independently, and navigation lights remained illuminated at night. For an aggressive submarine commander, these waters represented target-rich environments unmatched anywhere else in the Pacific. The Wahoo successfully transited the La Pérouse Strait sometime in mid-October 1943. Exact dates remain uncertain because the submarine maintained radio silence during this phase of the patrol. Japanese records and post-war analysis suggest that the Wahoo conducted multiple successful attacks in the Sea of Japan during the last 2 weeks of October, sinking several merchant vessels and creating panic among Japanese shipping authorities who suddenly realized their home waters were no longer safe. Morton had achieved his objective of penetrating Japan's inner defensive perimeter and demonstrating that American submarines could operate successfully anywhere the enemy considered secure. October 11, 1943 would be the last confirmed date that the Wahoo was known to be operational, based on Japanese records documenting an attack on a Japanese freighter near the western coast of Hokkaido. After that date, the Wahoo's fate becomes uncertain, reconstructed from Japanese records, survivor accounts, and post-war investigations. What is known with reasonable certainty is that the Wahoo never returned from her 7th patrol. When the submarine failed to arrive at Midway Island on her scheduled return date in late October, she was declared overdue and presumed lost. Morton, O'Kane's replacement as executive officer, and the entire crew of 60 men were gone. Post-war examination of Japanese records revealed that on October 11, 1943, Japanese anti-submarine forces reported attacking and possibly sinking a submarine in the La Pérouse Strait, near the location where the Wahoo would have been transiting during her exit from the Sea of Japan. Japanese aircraft had detected a submarine on the surface and conducted repeated depth charge and bombing attacks over several hours. The Japanese reports claimed the submarine was destroyed, citing an oil slick and debris field as evidence. Modern analysis, combining Japanese records with American submarine movement tracking, strongly suggests this attack destroyed the USS Wahoo, though absolute certainty remains impossible given the fragmentary nature of wartime records. The loss of the Wahoo and Morton shocked the submarine force. Morton had seemed invincible, his aggressive tactics had appeared to guarantee success, and his submarine had become a symbol of American naval dominance in the Pacific. His death forced a reckoning with the reality that aggression, while effective, carried inherent risks that even the most skilled commander could not entirely eliminate. The submarine force had to balance the lessons of Morton's successes against the sobering reminder of his loss. The tactical approaches he pioneered continued to be employed, but with somewhat more caution and with greater emphasis on escape planning and risk mitigation. Morton's final tally, confirmed through post-war analysis of Japanese records, stood at 19 ships sunk during his career as the Wahoo's commander, totaling approximately 55,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed. This made him one of the most successful submarine commanders in American naval history. His influence extended far beyond these statistics. The tactical doctrines he developed, the aggressive philosophy he embodied, and the example he set for other submarine commanders shaped American submarine warfare for the remainder of World War II and influenced submarine doctrine for decades afterward. The USS Wahoo received the Presidential Unit Citation, an organizational award recognizing extraordinary heroism in action against an enemy, for her third patrol, the mission where Morton's tactics had first demonstrated their full effectiveness. Individual crew members received numerous decorations. Morton himself was posthumously advanced to the rank of commander and received additional recognition for his contributions to the submarine force's success. O'Kane, Morton's protege, survived the war despite his own submarine's loss, and went on to write extensively about Morton's tactical philosophy, ensuring that the lessons of the Wahoo's war patrols would be preserved for future generations. In the decades following World War II, Morton and the Wahoo became subjects of numerous books, articles, and historical studies. The destroyer engagement, where Morton charged enemy warships, the Wewak harbor penetration, and the overall aggressiveness of the Wahoo's operations, became legendary examples studied in naval academies worldwide. The controversial aspects of Morton's career, particularly the Buyo Maru incident, generated ongoing debate about the boundaries of legitimate warfare and the moral complexities of submarine combat. These discussions, while sometimes uncomfortable, contributed to evolving understanding of warfare ethics and the laws of armed conflict. The Wahoo's story represents more than just military history. It exemplifies the impact that individual leadership, tactical innovation, and aggressive spirit can have on warfare's conduct and outcome. Morton demonstrated that conventional wisdom about submarine operations was not immutable law, but rather doctrine that could be challenged and improved. His willingness to question established practices, to experiment with new approaches, and to accept calculated risks in pursuit of mission success changed how the United States Navy employed its submarine force. The strategic impact of these changes contributed significantly to Japan's defeat by severing the maritime supply lines that sustained the Japanese war effort. Today, the USS Wahoo rests somewhere in the waters near La Perouse Strait, a steel tomb for 60 brave men who followed their captain into battle one final time. The submarine's exact location remains unknown, though periodic expeditions have searched for the wreck. Morton and his crew are remembered not just for the ships they sank or the tactical victories they achieved, but for demonstrating that courage, innovation, and aggressive action can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Their story continues to inspire naval officers and submariners, reminding each generation that warfare rewards not just technological superiority or numerical advantage, but also the willingness to challenge assumptions, embrace risk when strategically justified, and lead from the front regardless of danger. The Wahoo's war patrols, particularly that extraordinary third patrol where Morton charged destroyers that couldn't believe what they were seeing, remain among the most remarkable episodes in naval warfare history, a testament to what determined men in a steel tube beneath the waves could accomplish when led by a commander who understood that fortune truly favors the bold.